In the Langston mansion, silence ruled every hallway. For 6 years, laughter had been buried under grief. Mason and Caleb, deaf twin boys, lived in a world of shadows. Their father, Victor Langston, a billionaire broken by loss, told himself nothing could reach them. But then came Elise Carter, a young housekeeper with calloused hands and a secret dream of dance. One afternoon, unable to bear the stillness, she set down her battered speaker and whispered, "Come on, little ones, feel it." Music pulsed through the floor, her body swayed, and for the first time the twins giggled, stomping their tiny feet. From the doorway, Victor froze. His voice cut the air like a knife. "What is happening here?" Elise turned, breathless but unafraid. "They're alive, Mr. Langston. Can't you see? This isn't chaos, it's joy." One rhythm, one laugh, one fragile sign will begin to crack the walls of silence. But what happens when the fortress of a father's grief is forced to crumble? Stay with us to discover how healing can come from the most unexpected places. Support us by subscribing and share in the comments. Where are you listening to this story of resilience tonight? Charleston, South Carolina, carried a strange beauty in early autumn. The marshes that edged the city glistened under a thin veil of mist, while the oak-lined avenues whispered with Spanish moss swaying like tired curtains. The Langston estate, seated on the outskirts of town where the land curved toward the river, seemed more fortress than home. Built of pale gray stone with a roof of black slate, its towering windows reflected no light, as though the house itself resisted warmth. Rain had come through in the night, and the lawns were still wet, the fountains trickling faintly, but within the mansion silence ruled more heavily than the weather outside. Victor Langston, at 47 years old, was a man who wore silence like a second skin. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver beginning to cut through his once dark hair, he embodied the kind of rigid strength people mistook for composure. His eyes, a pale steel blue, had grown colder since the day tragedy broke his life in half. Those who knew him before spoke of a man once charming, even affable at social galas, his laughter carrying in deep, easy waves. But after the sudden death of his wife Evelyn, during childbirth 6 years ago, his expression hardened into something granite-like, and warmth became a currency he no longer spent. He dressed simply but with meticulous care. Crisp shirts, dark trousers, polished shoes that echoed against marble floors. To his children, Mason and Caleb, he was more shadow than father, a figure glimpsed between the long corridors, his voice a clipped command, never a lullaby. The twins themselves were his mirror and his torment. Mason and Caleb, both 6 years old, were born with silence stitched into their existence. Profoundly deaf since birth, they navigated their days not through sound, but through glances, gestures, and vibrations they could feel more than hear. Their hair, chestnut brown like their mother's, fell slightly over their brows, giving their round faces a soft melancholy. What set them apart most to any visitor was their identical attire, short-sleeved red shirts paired with dark denim shorts. Victor insisted upon this uniform, clinging to it because Evelyn had chosen red for them in her final days of pregnancy. To him, red symbolized memory, continuity, the fragile thread that still tied his children to the woman he lost. Mason, the elder by a few minutes, carried a sharper gaze, as though always searching for something lost. His small hands often clutched toys only to set them aside quickly, uninterested in play. Caleb, gentler in demeanor, followed his brother's lead, his movements hesitant, his eyes large and cautious. Together they drifted like twin shadows through the vast halls of the mansion, their footsteps soft on the Persian rugs, their silence amplifying the emptiness of the house. The mansion itself mirrored its master's grief. Once decorated with Evelyn's taste-rich tapestries, vases of fresh flowers, music drifting from a piano, now it had been stripped to essentials. Curtains remained drawn more often than not, furniture was polished to lifeless perfection, and the scent of lemon oil replaced that of roses. The staff obeyed Victor's rules. No unnecessary chatter, no music, no disruptions. The house functioned, but it did not breathe. Into this mausoleum of wealth and memory stepped Elise Carter. Elise was 28 years old, a woman whose presence contrasted sharply with the austerity of the estate. Tall and graceful, with smooth onyx skin and dark, expressive eyes, she carried in her movements a trace of rhythm she had never quite lost. Her hair, thick and tightly curled, she wore pinned neatly beneath a plain scarf while working, though a few strands often escaped, softening her angular cheekbones. Elise had once dreamed of becoming a dancer. As a teenager in Savannah, she had won local competitions, her body alive with music even when no one else could hear it. But her family's poverty cut those dreams short. After her mother fell ill and her father left, Elise became caretaker not just for herself, but for her younger sister, Tanya. Tanya Carter was 19, delicate and ambitious, studying sociology at Spelman College in Atlanta. Unlike Elise, Tanya still carried the hope of escape, the determination to claim a future that education promised. Elise, proud but weary, worked to send money for her sister's tuition, often cutting her own needs to the bone. She came to Charleston when an agency offered her a position as housekeeper in the Langston mansion. It wasn't just the generous pay, it was the promise of stability. With the Langston salary, Tanya's tuition would be safe. Elise told herself she had no illusions. This was work, not destiny. But when she stepped through those tall oak doors, greeted by silence so heavy it felt like stone pressing down on her chest, she sensed her task might be more than dusting tables and polishing silver. On her second day, she met the twins. They sat at the breakfast table, Mason on the left, Caleb on the right, both staring blankly at bowls of untouched oatmeal. Their arms lay limp at their sides, their faces unreadable. Elise approached with a smile, her instincts tugging her toward warmth. "Good morning," she said softly, though she knew her words carried little meaning to ears that could not catch them. She tapped the table gently, a rhythmic pattern, then gestured as if lifting a spoon. Caleb blinked, but did not move. Mason's eyes flicked toward her and away again, as though dismissing her attempt. The butler, Mr. Hayes, a stooped man in his 60s with thinning white hair and spectacles sliding down his nose, murmured from the corner, "They don't respond to much, miss. Best just set their plates and leave them be." Elise nodded politely, but inside she rebelled. She could not imagine children untouched by laughter, unmoved by play. To her, silence was not death. She had once danced barefoot on wooden floors, where the only sound was the thud of her heels and the rhythm of her breath. She knew that music was not always in the ears, it was in the body, in the heart. Victor entered a moment later, his towering figure filling the doorway. "Are they eating?" His tone was clipped, his gaze flicking from Elise to his sons without pause. Mason pushed his bowl away. Caleb mimicked him. Victor's jaw tightened. "Take it away," he ordered curtly, and strode off toward his office without waiting for response. Elise's chest tightened. She saw it then. This house wasn't merely quiet, it was suffocating. The children didn't only lack sound, they lacked connection. That evening, in her small room at the far wing of the mansion, Elise called Tanya. The line crackled. Tanya's voice carried both exhaustion and hope. "They raised tuition again, Elise. I don't know how I'll manage next semester." Elise closed her eyes, pressing the phone tighter. "I'll manage," she said firmly. "Don't you dare give up, Tanya. That degree is your way out. I'll keep this job, whatever it takes." She didn't tell Tanya about the silence, about the emptiness in the children's eyes. She didn't share how Victor's gaze was like ice, or how the mansion seemed to resent her every hum. But as she hung up, Elise sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. They were hands that had once painted arcs in the air, shaping stories with dance. Now they scrubbed marble and polished silver. Yet as she thought of Mason and Caleb, she felt something stir. Perhaps her job wasn't only about money. Perhaps her purpose here was not merely to survive. Days passed in the rhythm of routine. Elise dusted, folded, and cooked. The twins drifted silently through the halls, sometimes glancing at her, often ignoring her. Victor remained a figure glimpsed in shadows, his office door always closed. Rain fell frequently that week, tapping against the long windows, and the air inside smelled of damp wood and lemon polish. Elise felt the weight of the mansion pressing against her spirit, yet each time she glimpsed Mason's furrowed brows or Caleb's hesitant eyes, she remembered that silence was not absence. It was waiting, waiting for the right rhythm, the right touch, to bring it alive. By the end of her first week, Elise stood alone in the great hall as dusk crept through the high windows. She looked at the staircase where Mason and Caleb had paused earlier, watching her for just a moment longer than usual. It was small, fragile, but it was connection. She whispered into the dimness, as if to herself, "I will find a way. For Tanya, for them, for this house that forgot how to breathe." The chandeliers above glittered faintly, reflecting her vow, though no one heard it, not yet. The late afternoon light slanted through the tall bay windows of the Langston mansion, carrying with it the quiet hush of Charleston after a rain. Outside, the cobblestones still glistened, and a soft dampness lingered in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of magnolia leaves. The parlor, a cavernous room lined with heavy drapes and portraits of stern ancestors, sat in brooding silence as it always had. The ornate rug beneath the grand piano bore no scuffs, no evidence of laughter or play. But on that day, for the first time in years, the silence fractured. Elise Carter stood in the middle of the parlor with her old portable speaker in hand. It was a battered thing, scarred from years of use, a relic from her younger days when she still dared to believe she might perform on stage. She had carried it across state lines, across bus rides and borrowed apartments, a companion she refused to let go of. With a thumb pressed to its worn button, she released a song into the air, an old soul track, rich with rhythm, the kind of music that vibrated in bones even if ears could not catch it. Mason and Caleb, the 6-year-old twins in their familiar red shirts, sat at the edge of the couch like fragile statues. Their faces were blank, their hands still. But as the first notes reverberated through the floorboards, Mason blinked, lifting his chin slightly as though something invisible had brushed against him. Caleb, quieter and more hesitant, shifted, his small fingers tapping once against the fabric of the sofa. Elise's heart thudded. She placed the speaker on the floor so the vibrations could travel better. Then, with a deep breath, she let her body sway. Her hips moved first, gently rocking. Then her arms rose in graceful arcs, echoing movements she once practiced in studio mirrors when she believed dance was her destiny. Her braids loosened slightly as she spun, and her face softened with a smile she didn't have to force. She bent low, exaggerated each beat, showing the boys that music could be seen, not just heard. Mason tilted his head, then gave the smallest imitation, rocking his torso forward and back. Caleb giggled, an uncertain, high-pitched sound that burst into the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Elise clapped her hands, spinning again, and soon both boys were stumbling from the couch, their knees wobbly, their little feet stomping without rhythm, but with joy. The parlor, once a mausoleum, became alive. Mason giggled, clutching Elise's skirt as he tried to twirl, while Caleb slapped his palms against the polished table, laughing at the vibrations that echoed into his arms. Elise felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back, refusing to stop the flow of joy. She bent, holding their hands, guiding them in a simple sway. For a moment, it was just 3 bodies finding rhythm in a house that had long forgotten how. And then the door opened. Victor Langston stepped inside, the weight of his presence immediately altering the air. He had come from his office, a file in his hand, his tie slightly loosened from hours of work. His steel blue eyes froze at the sight before him. The file slipped from his grasp and landed on the floor with a dull slap. Mason and Caleb, his silent, withdrawn sons, were laughing, moving, alive in a way he had thought impossible. And at the center of it all stood Elise, her arms outstretched, her body swaying, her face radiant with warmth. Victor's jaw tightened. He felt something rip inside his chest. Astonishment, yes, but also a rising tide of anger. To him, the scene was chaos, a breach of control. For years he had trusted specialists, therapists, rigid schedules to manage his son's condition. And now, with one song, one careless act, Elise had undone his fortress. He stood there motionless, watching his world tilt on its axis. Elise noticed him only when Mason tugged at her skirt, pointing. She turned, her chest heaving, her braids sticking slightly to her forehead with sweat. When her eyes met Victor's, she froze. The music still played faintly, the boys still giggled, but the room felt suddenly heavy again. Victor's face was unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, without a word, Victor turned on his heel and walked out. The music seemed to falter, though it hadn't stopped. Elise pressed the button, silencing it. Mason and Caleb looked between her and the door, their small brows furrowed in confusion. Elise crouched, hugging them briefly, whispering though she knew they could not hear, "It's all right, little ones. It's all right." But her voice wavered, for she feared it was not. Later that evening, the house had returned to its oppressive quiet. Elise retreated to her room, her speaker clutched in her lap. The rain had begun again outside, pattering against her small window. She stared at her phone, its screen glowing with Tanya's name. With a trembling hand, she answered. Tanya's voice came fast, urgent. "Elise, they raised tuition again. If I can't cover the balance this semester, they'll pull me out. I've worked so hard, Elise. Please tell me you can help." Elise bit her lip until she tasted copper. She pictured Tanya slender, with almond-shaped eyes behind thick glasses, her hair tied in a bun as she studied late into the night at Spelman. Tanya had always been the dreamer, the believer that education could change everything. Elise had promised to protect that dream. "I'll find a way," Elise whispered fiercely. "I won't let them take this from you." "I'll keep this job, Tanya, no matter what." Her sister hesitated on the line, her voice softening. "You sound tired. Are they treating you badly?" Elise glanced at the silent halls beyond her door, thought of Victor's glacial stare, of the laughter she had coaxed only to have it silenced by fear. "It's just heavy here," she admitted. "But don't worry about me. Worry about your classes. Just hold on." When she hung up, Elise pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. She felt cornered. If Victor decided her behavior was unacceptable, she would lose not only her wages, but Tanya's future. Yet in her heart, she knew the laughter she'd seen that afternoon mattered more than any paycheck. Elsewhere in the mansion, Victor sat in his office, a single lamp casting long shadows across the shelves of leather-bound books. He poured himself a drink, though he rarely touched alcohol anymore. The glass trembled slightly in his hand as he remembered the sight. Mason's head thrown back in laughter, Caleb's tiny palms clapping against the table, and Elise in the center, unafraid to disrupt the silence. His sons had not laughed like that in their entire lives, but instead of gratitude, fury churned within him. Fury at the audacity of a servant thinking she could achieve what specialists had failed at. Fury at himself for daring to feel hope again. And beneath that, a fear that was harder to name, that perhaps the life he had built on structure and control was nothing but a fragile shell. In the servants' quarters, Elise finally lay down, exhausted, her body aching from both the dance and the weight of dread. She clutched the speaker to her chest as though it were armor. Sleep came slowly, haunted by visions of Mason's small hands reaching for her, and Victor's cold eyes shutting the door on them all. And so the house slept, each soul within it carrying a different burden. Two boys who had tasted joy for the first time. A woman desperate to keep both her job and her sister's dreams alive. And a father torn between anger, fear, and a fragile ember of hope he could not extinguish. The mansion of silence had cracked that day. But cracks, Victor thought bitterly, could either let light in or bring the whole structure down. Morning came with a humid stillness that clung to the sprawling Langston estate. Charleston's river breeze had carried a hint of salt through the trees, yet the mansion's air was as heavy as ever. The kitchen, though vast with gleaming marble counters and copper pots polished to a dull shine, felt empty most mornings. Meals were prepared by the staff in silence, served in silence, and cleared in silence. But today, Elise Carter entered with a spark of mischief in her step, her battered portable speaker tucked under her arm. She was determined to challenge the silence where it was loudest here, in the heart of the house. Mason and Caleb sat at the table with their identical red shirts wrinkled from restless tossing in bed. Their hair stuck up in little tufts, their eyes dull from the routine of another silent breakfast. A bowl of cereal sat in front of each, untouched. Elise paused at the counter, glancing at them. She saw two boys trapped not just by deafness but by an invisible wall that no therapy session had broken. She felt the memory of their laughter in the parlor still vibrating inside her, and though she feared Victor's cold fury, she could not let that spark die. She set her speaker down on the counter, but instead of turning it on, she reached for a wooden spoon. With a firm, deliberate gesture, she struck it against the rim of a pot. The clang echoed sharply, reverberating through the marble and into the boys' chests. Mason blinked and looked up. Caleb tapped his hand against the table, testing the vibration. Elise smiled, then struck again, this time adding a rhythm. 1, 2, pause, 3. She tapped her foot against the tiled floor in time. Her voice, though soft, carried playfulness. "Do you feel it?" Mason frowned, but his little fingers drummed against the table, unconsciously matching her pattern. Caleb's cheeks flushed as he slapped his palms flat on the wooden surface, grinning at the echo. Their faces came alive in ways no rigid schedule had managed. Elise continued, dragging the spoon across the pot for a long metallic scrape, then chopping vegetables with exaggerated beats, the knife hitting the board like percussion. The kitchen transformed into a makeshift stage, every tool and instrument, every surface part of an orchestra of vibrations. The boys were enthralled. Mason slid off his chair, stomped his small feet on the tile, and laughed at the tremor beneath him. Caleb clapped in sync, his pale hands reddening with effort. Elise swayed to their rhythm, guiding them like a conductor, her braids bouncing with each movement. She twirled a dish towel above her head as if it were a flag at a parade. The soundless music filled the space, not through ears but through bones and skin. But their joy was short-lived. The door to the kitchen swung open, and Victor Langston entered, crisp in a gray suit despite the heat outside. His steel-blue eyes took in the scene, his housekeeper pounding pots, his sons stomping on the floor, the air charged with disorder. His jaw clenched as though he had walked into a crime scene. "What is this?" His voice was sharp enough to slice through the vibrations. Elise froze mid-spin, the dish towel hanging limp in her hand. Mason and Caleb turned, their giggles faltering under their father's icy glare. Elise set down the spoon carefully, her chest rising and falling with the weight of confrontation. "They're responding," she said evenly. "They're alive here. Can't you see it?" Victor stepped closer, the anger in his stride palpable. His broad frame loomed over her, and for a moment Elise felt like a child caught breaking rules in a house where rules were law. "This is not therapy," he snapped. "This is chaos. I hired you to maintain order, not to play games with my children." "They're not games," Elise countered, surprising even herself with the steel in her voice. "This is life. This is joy. What they need most isn't another hour of drills, it's the chance to feel like children." The silence that followed was tense, humming like a wire pulled too tight. Mason clung to Elise's skirt, eyes wide, while Caleb shuffled back, chewing his lip nervously. Victor's fists tightened at his sides. He could feel the tremor in his chest, the pull between fury and something he dared not name. "Enough," he said. "You will not undermine the structure this house depends on. Pack your things. You're finished here." The words struck Elise harder than she expected, though part of her had feared this very moment since the day she turned on her speaker in the parlor. She looked down at Mason's hand gripping her skirt, at Caleb's desperate stare. Behind their silence, she saw a plea. Her throat ached, but before she could speak, Mason raised his small hands and shaped a shaky sign. "Papa." Victor froze. The boy's fingers trembled, his gesture imperfect, but unmistakable. Caleb mirrored him, signing with clumsy eagerness, then pointing toward his father, his lips moving silently as though urging him to join. "Papa, dance." The world seemed to tilt beneath Victor's feet. His sons, his silent, unreachable sons, were calling to him. Not through words, not through doctors, but through a gesture born of joy. His chest constricted, his breath shallow. He wanted to lash out, to dismiss it as mimicry, but his legs betrayed him, rooted to the spot. Elise's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She whispered, though the boys could not hear, "They're asking for you." Victor stared at them, at the way Mason's small hands wavered in the air, at the hope blazing in Caleb's eyes. For years he had lived convinced nothing could reach them, yet here they were reaching for him. The air in the kitchen was heavy, the scent of chopped onions mingling with the sharp tang of his aftershave, the silence now louder than any vibration. Victor swallowed, his throat raw, but no words came. He turned abruptly, his footsteps heavy as he left the room, the echo of their tiny signs searing into his mind like a brand. Elise gathered the boys into her arms, kissing the tops of their heads, though they could not hear the comfort in her murmurs. She knew she had walked a dangerous line, perhaps even lost her place here, but nothing could erase what had just happened. The boys had reached for their father, and he could not unsee it. That night, as Elise returned to her room, her phone buzzed again. Tanya's voice shook on the other end. "Elise, they've sent the notice. If I don't pay the balance in 2 weeks, I'll be dropped from all my classes." Elise pressed her forehead against the cool wood of her door. "I'll handle it," she said softly, though her voice trembled. She was being torn in two between her sister's future and the fragile hope flickering in the mansion's kitchen. She could not abandon either, but she could not carry both alone. As she ended the call, her speaker sat on her nightstand, a mute witness to her struggle. Elise stared at it, wondering if the rhythm she had created today had been a miracle or a mistake that would cost her everything. But downstairs, in the darkened halls, Mason and Caleb whispered in their own way through taps on the floor, through clumsy hand gestures practiced in secret. Their laughter, faint but real, lingered in the air like an echo that refused to die. And though Victor lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling with his chest tight, one image haunted him relentlessly, 2 small pairs of hands signing Papa. Night in Charleston settled heavily upon the Langston estate, the kind of night where cicadas sang in the trees and the air hung with the faint brine of the nearby river. The mansion, with its looming gray stone and shuttered windows, looked almost deserted against the humid dark. Inside, silence pressed down with its usual weight, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock in the hall. But within a small room tucked into the far wing of the house, Elise Carter sat at her narrow desk, a lamp throwing a weak pool of light across her papers. Her roughened hands traced unfamiliar shapes, the curves and angles of a language she was desperate to master. Elise had borrowed a slim beginner's guide to American Sign Language from the Charleston Public Library earlier that week. The librarian, Mrs. Halloran, had been kind enough not to ask too many questions. A woman in her early 60s with a gentle face framed by gray curls, Mrs. Halloran wore bright scarves as though to fight the dull beige of the library walls. She had glanced at Elise's calloused hands, at the weariness in her eyes, and simply said, "Good luck, dear," before sliding the book across the counter. Elise carried those words like a benediction. Now, she practiced each letter of the manual alphabet, her fingers stiff and unsteady, repeating motions until they blurred. On one page, she had scrawled the words she most wanted to give the twins: play, love, Papa. Her hands cramped, her shoulders ached, but she pressed on. Each gesture felt like chiseling into the wall that surrounded Mason and Caleb. If she could carve even the smallest opening, maybe they would step through. Down the hall, Mason and Caleb lay curled in their beds, their red shirts abandoned on a chair, their breathing slow and even. Elise knew she should rest too, but her body resisted. Sleep would not change anything. Effort might. She closed her eyes, imagining the boys' wide gazes when they recognized a shape she made with her hands. That hope drove her. Days became weeks, and little by little, Elise introduced the signs she had practiced. She did it gently, during breakfast when she signed eat before setting down their bowls, during play when she shaped ball while rolling one across the floor, during quiet moments when she folded her arms across her chest in the gesture for love. Mason's eyes would follow her hands, cautious but intrigued. Caleb, more timid, would hesitate before mimicking, his small fingers fumbling, but his grin would break open each time she nodded encouragement. Victor noticed. He always noticed. Though he rarely commented, his pale eyes tracked Elise when she raised her hands, his jaw set tighter than usual. He did not intervene, but neither did he acknowledge the progress. To him, hope was dangerous. He had let himself believe in miracles once, and it had ended in a coffin. He would not let hope in again, not when it might betray him twice. So he remained silent, retreating behind his office door, convincing himself that the flickers of change he saw were nothing but tricks of light. Elise felt the tension coil tighter each day. She wanted to reach Victor, to show him that his children were not locked beyond reach, but she knew his grief was a fortress. Sometimes, as she passed his study at night, she heard the low murmur of his voice as he argued with himself, pacing the floor, a man at war with ghosts. She wished she could knock, step in, tell him that walls could crack without collapsing. But she kept walking, her heart heavy. Her phone calls with Tanya grew more desperate. One evening, as Elise folded laundry in the servants' quarters, Tanya's voice trembled through the receiver. "Elise, they told me I have until the end of the month. If I don't pay, I'll be dropped from all my classes. I can't lose this. Please, tell me you'll figure something out." Elise pressed her forehead into the pile of warm shirts, fighting the sting in her eyes. "I'm trying, Tanya. I swear I am, but I don't know how much longer I'll last here. Mr. Langston?" Her voice trailed off. She didn't want to frighten her sister with the truth, that Victor's patience with her was fraying, that she was one misstep away from losing her position. "You always take on too much alone," Tanya said, her tone softening. "Ever since Mama died, you've been carrying me. Maybe it's time I—" "Don't say it," Elise cut her off sharply. "You're going to finish. You'll have a life better than this. I won't let them take that from you." After the call ended, Elise sat alone with her thoughts. If she left for another job with better pay, she could save Tanya's future. But Mason and Caleb, she pictured their hesitant fingers shaping love. They would lose the fragile light that had just begun to flicker. The weight of the choice pressed so heavily she felt crushed between two impossible responsibilities. The house itself seemed to sense her turmoil. The halls felt darker, the silence heavier, as if the mansion was holding its breath, waiting for her to break. Yet each time Mason tugged her hand to show her an awkward sign, or Caleb shyly shaped play with his small fists, Elise found herself unable to walk away. One evening, as dusk bled into night and the cicadas outside screamed their relentless chorus, Victor entered the nursery where Elise sat with the boys. She had shown them the sign for Papa, her fingers steady as she crossed them against her cheek. Caleb mimicked clumsily, his giggle high-pitched. Mason, more serious, studied her intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Victor leaned against the doorway, his face unreadable. "What is it you think you're doing?" His voice was low, controlled, but edged with steel. Elise looked up, refusing to shrink. "I'm giving them a way to reach you." "They don't need illusions," Victor replied, his gaze fixed on Mason. "They need structure, discipline, not—" He gestured vaguely, as if the motions of her hands were beneath words. "They need you," Elise said softly. "Not as a shadow, not as a man who hides in his office. They need their father." The words struck him like a blow. For a moment his eyes flickered, but then his walls rose again. "Don't presume to know what my children need," he snapped, turning away. His footsteps echoed down the hall, each one sounding like a door slammed shut. Elise's shoulders sagged, yet when she looked back at the boys, she found Mason staring not at her, but at the empty doorway where his father had stood. Slowly, deliberately, Mason raised his hands and shaped the sign. Papa. The gesture was clumsy, his fingers crooked, but the intent was clear. He looked toward the hall, his dark eyes wide, waiting. At that moment, Victor returned, perhaps drawn back by something he didn't understand. He stepped into the room just as Mason signed again. Their eyes met, father and son, across the small space. For years, Victor had believed he could never be reached, never be needed in a way he could answer. But now, in the trembling motion of his son's hands, he saw a plea so raw it cracked the wall he had built inside himself. Victor's breath hitched. He pressed a hand to his face, trying to hide the tears that burned suddenly and without mercy. But Mason had already seen. Caleb, sensing the shift, climbed onto his brother's lap and signed the same shaky word. Papa. And for the first time since Evelyn's death, Victor Langston broke. His shoulders shook as tears slipped past his defenses, silent but relentless. He covered his mouth, but the sob caught in his chest and escaped anyway, ragged and unrestrained. The fortress he had spent years maintaining crumbled with a single word in a language he had never learned. Elise, stunned, reached for the boys, gathering them close. She did not speak. There were no words needed. The crack in the wall had opened. Whether it would heal or widen, she did not know. But for the first time, the silence in the Langston mansion carried something new possibility. The morning sun over Charleston brought no warmth to the Langston mansion. The gardens shimmered with dew, magnolia leaves glossy in the light. Yet inside the house, shadows pooled in corners as though refusing to leave. Victor Langston had not slept well. He sat at the head of the long dining table, his hands clasped, waiting for the arrival of Dr. Harold Stein, the pediatric neurologist who had been following Mason and Caleb since birth. Victor had always trusted Dr. Stein. A tall, spare man in his mid-60s with thinning gray hair combed straight back and rimless spectacles that seemed to magnify his sharp eyes, Stein embodied clinical authority. He was known in Charleston's medical circles as uncompromising, precise, and sometimes brusque. He had lost his wife to illness many years before, and since then his demeanor had hardened into a sort of armor. Compassion was not absent from him, but it was hidden under layers of scientific caution. He arrived in a charcoal suit, his leather briefcase swinging at his side, his expression impassive as he stepped into the silent halls of the Langston estate. "Mr. Langston," he said with a curt nod, setting down his case on the polished table. "Let's see how the boys are progressing." Elise stood nearby, her hands tightening around a dish towel. She had been dreading this moment. She knew Mason and Caleb had made strides, awkward signs, hesitant laughter, attempts at connection, but under the stern gaze of Dr. Stein, she feared they would collapse into themselves. Her eyes darted to the staircase where the twins descended slowly, their red shirts bright against the gloom. Mason's steps were deliberate, his dark eyes flicking nervously to his father. Caleb trailed a half-pace behind, clutching the banister, his face pale with unease. Elise tried to offer them a reassuring smile, lifting her hand discreetly in the sign for love. Mason's gaze softened for an instant, but when he saw Dr. Stein's unsmiling face, his shoulders hunched. The evaluation began in the sunroom, where light streamed through high windows onto the tiled floor. Stein placed a set of blocks on the low table. "Show me," he said, his voice flat. He gestured for Mason to arrange them by color. Mason hesitated, his small fingers twitching. He glanced at Elise, who signed play gently, but Stein cleared his throat, the sound sharp as a reprimand. Mason froze, then shoved the blocks aside, his chin dropping to his chest. Stein's pen scratched against his notebook. "Still resistant," he murmured. Caleb was asked to mimic simple gestures. Elise had shown him Papa countless times, and he had giggled each time he shaped it. Now, under the doctor's watch, he pressed his hands into his lap and stared at the floor. His lips trembled, as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't. Stein wrote again, his brow furrowed. "No significant development. Responses appear inconsistent, possibly imitative rather than communicative. Victor's face darkened. His pride, already fragile, burned under the weight of judgment. He saw Stein's impassive notes, heard the quiet scrape of his pen, and humiliation clawed at him. Weeks of Elise's efforts, of laughter in the kitchen, of trembling hands signing Papa, seemed to dissolve into nothing. "They've made progress," Elise blurted, unable to contain herself. "You should have seen them last night. Mason signed Papa, Caleb too. They're trying, they are reaching out." Stein looked at her over the rim of his glasses, his eyes cool. "With respect, Miss Carter, I rely on evidence, not anecdotes. I've seen many families confuse emotional mimicry with cognitive breakthroughs. False hope can be damaging." Victor's jaw tightened, his fists pressed into the armrests of his chair. "So what you're saying," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "is that all of this," he gestured sharply toward Elise, "has been nothing but tricks, illusions." Elise's throat constricted. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's real. They—" "Enough!" Victor thundered, rising to his feet. His chair scraped harshly against the tile. "You've filled my house with noise, with disorder, and now I see you filled me with lies. You gave me illusions, Miss Carter. You made me believe things that aren't there. Do you know what that does to a father who has already lost everything?" His voice cracked on the last word, but his fury masked the pain. Elise stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides. The twins shrank against the sofa, their eyes darting between the adults, confusion written across their small faces. Dr. Stein closed his notebook with a soft snap. "I'll prepare my report," he said simply, and gathered his case. His departure was swift, leaving behind a silence sharper than any rebuke. When the door closed, Victor turned his back to Elise, his broad shoulders rigid. "You are dismissed," he said, his voice cold and final. "Pack your things." Elise staggered as though struck. All the hours spent tracing signs until her fingers ached. All the fragile progress coaxed out of silence. All the laughter she had believed in. It felt shattered. She stumbled to her room, her chest hollow, and sank onto the bed. Her phone buzzed at once. Tanya's voice came through, strained and broken. "Elise, I can't hold on anymore. I got the official notice today. If I don't pay, I'll be expelled. I can't do this." Elise pressed her hands against her eyes, fighting tears. "I'll come home," she whispered. "I'll find another job. Something better paid. You won't lose this chance, Tanya." "But what about those boys?" Tanya asked softly. "You sound like you love them." Elise's breath caught. She thought of Mason's determined brow, of Caleb's shy giggle, of the way they clung to her hands. "They'll survive," she said, though the words felt like ashes. "They have their father." But as she packed her small suitcase, her heart rebelled. She knew the truth. If she left, the house would fold back into silence, and the fragile light she had kindled would die. She was losing everything at once, her sister's future, the twins' laughter, her own hope. That evening she lingered in the hallway one last time, her bag in hand. The air was heavy with rain, the windows streaked with droplets. As she passed the grand staircase, she saw Mason standing alone in the parlor. He was small, almost swallowed by the high ceilings and towering portraits. His eyes were fixed on a photograph that hung on the wall, a picture of Evelyn Langston, his mother, radiant and alive. Slowly, Mason raised his hands. His fingers shaped the word Elise had shown him, imperfect but clear. "Mama." Elise gasped. Caleb appeared beside his brother, following the movement, his lips parting in silent imitation. Their faces, lit by the dim chandelier, carried both longing and recognition, as though they had finally found the word to bind their emptiness. At that moment, Victor entered the room. He stopped dead, his eyes riveted on his sons. He saw their small hands signing, their gaze fixed on Evelyn's face. The fortress inside him crumbled, his knees buckled, and for the first time since the day his wife died, Victor Langston fell to the floor, his hand pressed to his chest as tears spilled unchecked. Elise dropped her suitcase, her own tears streaming as she rushed to steady the boys. Victor's sobs filled the room, not the roar of anger, but the raw sound of a man broken open. The word mama, clumsy on his children's hands, had shattered him more than any loss, but it had also pierced the silence with something deeper than grief. For the first time, the Langston mansion breathed. Late afternoon sunlight spilled across the lawns of the Langston mansion, painting the windows in gold. The air was thick with the warmth of early summer, heavy but not oppressive, carrying the distant cries of gulls from the river. Inside, the mansion had changed in ways subtle yet profound. Where once the silence had pressed like a weight on every surface, now it felt restless, as if waiting for something more. The echo of Mason and Caleb's hands signing Mama still lingered in the halls, and Victor had spent days haunted by it, pacing the corridors like a man at war with his own shadow. Elise Carter had continued her work quietly, expecting each morning to be her last in the house. Victor had not spoken of dismissing her again, but his eyes were unreadable, filled with a turmoil that neither accusation nor gratitude could fully express. Still, she stayed, cooking meals, folding laundry, and when no one was watching, teaching Mason and Caleb new words with her hands. The boys thrived, their giggles bubbling up more often, their signs becoming clearer, their steps less hesitant. Yet she carried her own dread. Tanya's tuition was still due, and time was running out. One particularly humid afternoon, Mason toddled into the drawing room dragging Elise's battered speaker by its fraying strap. Caleb followed, his cheeks flushed with determination. Elise, wiping her hands on a towel after tidying the kitchen, found them crouched by the window seat, fingers fumbling over the buttons until a burst of tinny music filled the air. Mason looked up at her with wide, insistent eyes, his little hands signing dance. Caleb copied clumsily, his lips forming a half sound like da. Elise laughed softly, bending low. "You two troublemakers," she murmured, though her chest warmed with pride. She set the towel aside, lifted her arms, and began to sway. The boys squealed in their own way, Mason stomping his feet, Caleb spinning with arms flailing, and soon the room pulsed with their rhythm. Then, almost in unison, they turned toward the hallway where they knew their father often lingered unseen. Their small hands moved in shaky gestures, both of them signing together, "Come, Papa." Victor had been standing in the shadows, drawn by the sound of faint music. When he saw their hands rise, their eyes filled with expectation, he froze. His heart pounded so violently he thought he might collapse. For years he had hidden behind grief, building walls to keep himself from hope. And now those same walls were crumbling, chipped away not by doctors or discipline, but by the clumsy gestures of two little boys who had never stopped wanting him. For a long moment, Victor remained rooted, his body rigid, his breath caught. But then something inside him gave way. He stepped forward into the light of the room. The boys clapped, their eyes shining, and Elise, still swaying, met his gaze. Her expression was not triumphant but gentle, as though she understood the enormity of what this moment demanded. Victor inhaled shakily, then raised his arms. His movements were awkward, his steps uncertain, but he swayed with them. Mason giggled, grabbing his father's hand, while Caleb spun into his leg and held on tightly. Victor crouched low to their level, his broad shoulders trembling as laughter, his own, rusty and broken, escaped his lips. The Langston mansion, once suffocated by silence, rang with joy. Elise turned away for a moment, covering her mouth to hide the tears that threatened. She had never seen such a sight, the fortress of a man undone by the laughter of his children. It was imperfect, messy, clumsy, but perfect in every way that mattered. Later that evening, while the children slept, Victor sat at his desk with a stack of bills and statements. He had thought long and hard in the hours after the dance. Elise had given his sons life again, and her devotion extended beyond the walls of his home. He remembered overhearing fragments of her whispered phone calls, the way her voice cracked when speaking of her sister. Without announcing his decision, Victor arranged for a transfer. Tanya Carter's tuition, paid in full for the year. He did not sign his name but left it anonymous, though part of him suspected Elise would guess the truth. The following morning, Elise received a call. Tanya's voice was breathless, trembling with disbelief. "Elise! The balance, it's gone. Someone paid everything. I don't know who, but I can stay. I can finish my degree." Elise sank into a chair, tears spilling freely. Relief washed over her so strongly she felt dizzy. "Tanya, you'll finish. You'll make it." Her gaze drifted toward the upper hall where Victor's footsteps moved faintly. She knew. She didn't need proof. Gratitude swelled in her chest, mingled with something deeper she dared not name. From that day forward, Elise no longer thought of herself as simply a housekeeper. She became part of the rhythm of the house, the quiet current that kept it alive. Mason and Caleb followed her everywhere, signing clumsy words, laughing when she applauded. Sometimes, haltingly, they even tried to speak, little syllables tumbling awkwardly but joyfully from their lips. She celebrated each attempt as though it were a miracle. Even the staff noticed the change. Mr. Hayes, the aging butler who had once advised Elise to expect nothing, remarked one afternoon as he polished silver, "I never thought I'd see them laugh in this house again. You've done something remarkable, Miss Carter." His voice, normally dry and clipped, carried genuine warmth. Elise only smiled and shook her head. "They did it themselves," she said quietly. "I just gave them a chance." The mansion itself seemed transformed. Where once the air had been heavy with grief, now it carried echoes of small feet running down the halls, of blocks clattering across the floor, of giggles that lingered even after bedtime. The grand piano in the parlor remained untouched, but the boys had discovered how to bang the keys in playful rhythms, and Elise encouraged them, clapping along instead of silencing them. Even Victor, once horrified by disorder, found himself smiling at the chaos. One evening, as the cicadas began their chorus outside and fireflies blinked across the lawn, Victor stood on the balcony with Elise. Mason and Caleb had just been tucked into bed, their red shirts tossed carelessly over chairs, their breathing even and soft. The night air carried the faint scent of jasmine. Victor leaned against the railing, his eyes on the stars. "I thought I had lost them," he said finally, his voice low, almost fragile. "I thought they would never reach me." "They never stopped trying," Elise replied gently. "You just couldn't see it until now." Victor turned, meeting her gaze. In her eyes, he saw not judgment but understanding. And in that moment, he realized she was no longer simply a housekeeper. She was the bridge that had brought him back to his sons. The months that followed only deepened the transformation. Mason and Caleb learned to sign more words: happy, play, love. Their fingers more confident each day. Sometimes they babbled sounds, imperfect but precious. They played in the garden, chasing butterflies, their laughter carrying through the hedges. Elise guided them patiently, celebrating every step, every sound. And Victor, once content to watch from a distance, now knelt in the grass with them, his trousers stained, his heart full. At last, the mansion no longer breathed in silence. It breathed with the heartbeat of a family reborn. Sometimes the walls we build around ourselves are not meant to keep others out, but to keep our own pain in. Yet love has a way of slipping through the cracks. What Victor, Elise, Mason, and Caleb remind us is that healing rarely arrives with grand gestures. It often comes in laughter over small moments, in clumsy hands signing a word, in the courage to open our hearts one more time. In our everyday lives, we all carry invisible walls, but joy, kindness, and faith can break them down. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below, subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this, and join this family of love and encouragement. May God bless you and your loved ones. And if you believe that families can be reborn through love, write Amen in the comments.